The year is 1729, and the standard of living in Ireland leaves much to be desired. People all over the country are suffering due to famine, and those not dead already are busy revolting against Britain. Most of your family and friends have desperately fled the country, looking to start a new life in England or elsewhere in Europe. Plenty of food is being produced in Ireland, but with almost all of it being imported to fuel the British economy, the citizens around you are literally starving on the streets. As a political advocate and popular writer/essayist, you feel it's up to you to bring light to these injustices. Maybe if what you write is compelling enough, the British aristocracy, or even the government, may listen. Quill in your hand and parchment across from you, you begin writing your masterpiece. Soon after, there's an uproar in the British aristocracy. An anonymous essay is the talk of the high class. An anonymous essay that suggests and advocates for the practice of producing, fattening, then feasting on children. Someone grab the fainting couch. Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. Today we're going to be looking at the next disturbing novel, A Modest Proposal by Jonathan Swift. Except this one isn't actually a novel, it's an essay. Therefore, this video stands to be a lot shorter of the others, since the source material is only about 10 to 15 pages in a modern digital document. I'll still be trying my best to summarise as much details as possible for you and give you some context of the essay as a whole before giving the text a general and disturbing rating. Just a reminder that if you want a spoiler-free review, I will leave my ratings for this in the comments below. Jonathan Swift himself was born in 1667 and raised by his mother with help from his uncle, who was his personal benefactor after his father died of... He received a formal education and went back from Ireland to England for some of his adult life. He wrote much of his work in the beginnings of the 18th century and maintained a pretty middle-class lifestyle despite often writing articles intended for the aristocracy. He became very interested in politics, especially the political situation between Ireland and Britain. My information on this time period is a little narrow, and I don't want to spread any misinformation about the economical and political climate of Ireland during this period, especially since some of these conflicts are still ongoing today, albeit in a evolved and lesser fashion. I did study Irish history and immigration in school, but that was predominantly late 19th and early 20th century as opposed to the 18th century. From my understanding, the conflict emerged from Britain doing what Britain does best and using other countries as cash cows. Irish land and citizens were used to produce crops and factory goods that were immediately imported back to England, leaving little for Irish themselves to reap. Ireland at this time wasn't officially part of the UK, however the king still ruled it and the British government advised the Irish Parliament. So begins a situation where Britain, the colonial school bully, does the equivalent of the stop hitting yourself move onto a tired Ireland who just wants to survive the school year. On top of all this was complicated religious tension between the predominantly Irish Catholics and English Protestants, which I am definitely not going into as a Scottish person who still sees the effects of these tensions in my current climate. Every single time I go to record a video, which is rare because I get nervous doing it, there's always someone outside hammering or work's being done next door. And this isn't a busy area. This stuff doesn't happen often. But for some reason, every single time that I want to start a video, it happens. I'm gonna have to just ignore it and try my best to filter it out / not talk when it's there. If you hear it, I do apologise. Britain looked past the culture and citizens and history of Ireland and just saw rich land and workers for the taking, and understandably Ireland didn't like that. Swift became aware of this and advocated against it, but not necessarily in a way that a lot of people think he did. Swift is sometimes wrongly cast as a lower class writer, sickened with empathy for those suffering and desperate to make things right. In reality, he was middle class and was not as affected by the economic climate as most others in Ireland. His purpose in writing the essay was much more political than empathetical. That's not to say he was evil or anything. I'm sure he did have empathy. It's just that in more recent analysis of the text, it's believed and evidence that Swift was tackling more the government's response to poverty as opposed to the poverty and suffering itself. At the time, the government was attempting to come up with a quick, genius economic saving solution instead of trying to slowly improve the economic situation over time. They were looking for a miracle solution. Swift thought this was a foolish approach that solved the symptoms instead of the actual problem, prompting him to write a modest proposal, a satirical essay that mocked these miracle solutions that the government were so desperate to produce. So let's dive into the essay ourselves, shall we? A modest proposal for preventing the children of poor people in Ireland from being a burden on their parents or country, and for making them beneficial to the public. Clearly a short and snappy title. The essay begins by citing how terrible it is for both locals and tourists of Dublin to be forced to see and subsequently be pestered by beggar women and their numerous children, further stating that most of these children grow up and leave the country, or, as he believes, becomes useless in some way or another. Swift exclaims that he has come up with a solution that will be beneficial not only to the beggar children, but to their parents and society as a whole. He reminds the reader of how expensive a child can be, especially when they eventually need solid foods as opposed to their mother's milk. Swift therefore proposes that children past a certain age be used for food and clothing, similarly to how animals are used. He states he can name many advantages to this. He claims this would reduce the rate of abortions and child murder. Ironically, he exclaims horror at the idea of women having to murder their child due to poverty, which is kind of funny to me because it implies that his problem isn't with children being killed, it's with their meat being wasted. So, I wonder what his opinions are on Ed Gein. He roughly calculates that there's 120,000 poor children in Ireland. This takes into account the population, infertile women, natural infant deaths, and miscarriages. He then suggests that all of these children are useless to society unless they're particularly gifted, as they cannot contribute to the architecture, craft, or agriculture, and are not able to pick up these skills fast enough. Swift assures the reader that merchants have told him a child will not profit when sold above the age of 12, and even after that they're not worth much. He goes on to tell us about an American friend of his that assures him that a young, healthy child, well nursed, is at a year old a most delicious, nourishing, and 60 wholesome food, whether stewed, roasted, baked, or boiled. Swift suggests that out of all the poor children, 20,000 should be kept for breeding and the rest should be sold to the rich as food. He says that only a quarter of breeders will need to be male, as due to their poor lineage they will probably be happy to impregnate multiple girls if needed, as if it wasn't the upper middle to high class throwing wild Regency sex parties. He believes that mothers should use the last month before selling to plump up their child by nursing them more. Then we receive some lovely serving suggestions. According to Swift, one child will do for 2 dishes when entertaining guests on day 1. A fore or hind quarter will do for a family for the next couple days. Lastly, on day 4, the remaining meat may be boiled with salt and pepper. The next line provides us with the most blatant sarcasm from Swift so far, as he writes the meat will be expensive, which will tempt landlords as they have already extorted or devoured, as he says, the parents. Obviously in reference to the steep, unreasonable prices that landlords were charging for tenants at the time. He then goes on to say that in addition to other benefits, it may reduce the number of Baptists in Ireland. This is an outdated term that was a derogatory way of referring to Catholics at the time, mainly used by Protestants. This is also a sarcastic. What could you possibly be doing? What could you possibly... Are they drilling into our house? This is also a sarcastic remark from Swift, who was a strong defendant of the Catholic people and the mistreatments they faced at the end of England, which was predominantly Protestant. Jesus. He alleges this due to the fact that many children are conceived during Lent, a yearly Catholic religious observance. Swift calculates that the average child costs a mother 2 shillings per annum, yet would be worth around 10 shillings sold as a carcass. Fuck. On top of this, the mother would be able to go back to work before she produces another child for meat. I know this is satirical, but being real, 8 shillings profit is not worth 9 months of back pain, and I'm not even going to mention labour itself. I get the smallest twinges of pain in my back, and all of a sudden I feel like an elderly Victorian man who worked in the coal mines all his life. 9 months of that for today's equivalent of... What was it again? 10 shillings... 50 pence? Well, that's 1919, so let's check for inflation. So like £95 nowadays? That's a single M&S weekly shop. That's if you're lucky. This essay really is written by a man, because if I'm going through all of that, I better be getting at least like 25 crowns for pregnancy alone, and further interest depending how long I'm in labour. But I digress. He goes on forth to suggest that the bargain hunters among us could use leftover child scraps to make fashionable gloves or boots. Butchers may also use children as meat, but to keep the meat tenderised it would be better to roast them live. I just hate when my child carcass is untenderised. But what is this? A challenger has arrived, and he has some pretty hot takes. When discussing this idea with another esteemed patriot, they suggest that the meat of teenagers up to 14 may be used as a substitute for venison meat. Swift respectfully declines this suggestion, stating that the meat of teenage boys... And I thought that was a good take. Swift respectfully declines this suggestion, stating that the meat of a teenage boy would be too tough and lean with exercise, and that a teenage girls would be too frivolous a discardment of so soon a breeder. And of course, who could forget the moral uproar, as some unjust citizens may see the feasting on of older children as cruel. And cruelty, as Swift says himself, hath always been with me the strongest objection against any project, how well soever intended. Or in other words, the ends just not justify the means. More very on-the-nose irony. His friend apparently got this idea when he heard about the island of Formosa, where any person sent to be executed would be sold after death by the executioner. Apparently, an executed plump teen girl's meat once went for 400 crowns. That's more like it. According to him, some of the local towns could be financially saved if they sold their plump teen girls for a similar price. I wonder how much I would go for. You can't blame someone for wondering in this economy. His friend was told the story by a very worthy source, that of George Salmanazar? That sounds American though. Salmanazar. George Salmanazar. A real writer who grew up there. Formosa was the name at the time for Taiwan, by the way. George, because no, I'm not attempting to say that last name again, travelled around Britain boasting of being the first native of Formosa to visit Europe and telling many tales of his time there. He told them that the natives walked around wearing nothing other than gold, and that men could legally eat cheating wives and priests would frequently dine on the bodies of sinners. This would have been a really fascinating place to visit if it was true. George was really born in France. He had never even visited Formosa, and gained fame and wealth for spreading his tales about life in such an exotic place. As mentioned, all of this is really true. George was a famous literary fraud. He's been mocked by other authors such as Tobias Smollett, and he's undoubtedly being mocked here as a so-called very good source that Swift's fictitious friend, the Good Patriot, has taken ideas from. There's another tangent addressed to the old and sick where Swift basically states there's no use for them and one shouldn't care if they're killed, for they're dying every day anyway. And I'm starting to realise where Rishi Sunak started taking inspiration from. Another useless area of society is that of young poor labourers, as although they do work, they soon become so malnourished that they become sick and cannot work. Therefore, they should be written off sooner rather than later. Swift soon turns back to his original point and states that he has many reasons why he believes his proposal is the optimal outcome for Ireland. He numbers these reasons for our convenience. First, it would reduce the number of Catholics who he sarcastically condemns for staying behind to support their home country. Secondly, the poor could produce things which they could sell to keep their home and belongings safe from landlords. Imagine your occupation being down as a breeder. Margaret Atwood would be proud. Thirdly, the money that would be spent on raising older children will be put into circulation for the economy. Not to mention the great new dish will keep the elites happy. The flesh being produced is made in Ireland for Ireland. Fourthly, women who are constantly having children will profit greatly, instead of paying to maintain their children's health after the first year. Fifthly, a new dish will be seasoned and perfected by many cooks that will improve tavern income and culture. Sixthly, it would encourage marriage as a means for profit, and men would be less likely to be cruel and beat their wives for fear of miscarriage, aka loss of profits. I mean, honestly, this one's kind of accurate. Even the worst men usually take a little bit more care of their wives when they're pregnant, seeing as they're actually useful to them. It's not fair and obviously shouldn't be justified, but it is true. Seventhly, is that even a word? The taste of children would far surpass that of other common meats such as pork, which is overused. And now we're getting into food politics. Swift says there are many other reasons he could state, but in the interest of brevity he shall admit them. According to his calculations, around 20,000 carcasses will be taken off by Dublin annually, while a further 80,000 will be sold elsewhere. He firmly states he can think of no possible objection towards his proposal other than the threat of underpopulation. He sees this as a positive for the kingdom, however, rather than a drawback, as he states that this proposal is only intended for Ireland and is calculated for the benefit of Ireland only. Therefore, world population would be minimally affected. Since his proposal is flawless, he begs that no man propose other preposterous solutions, such as taxing those who left Ireland, only consuming their own produce and craftsmanship, rejecting the vanity of overpriced luxury products, discouraging harmful vanity in women, of learning temperance and patriotism, of fighting against one another like the Jews did when their kingdom fell. His words, not mine. Of retaking land, encouraging empathy in landlords, and lastly of encouraging independent shopkeepers to increase their skill and honesty so that buying only native goods becomes a much more valuable option. He states that these things should never be suggested, as there's almost no hope they will ever be put into practice. These are, of course, for the most part, good suggestions, except the Jewish thing. I'm not even going to start with that. The irony being, of course, that the proposal is so very barbaric compared to these genuinely achievable proposals. I will give Jonathan Swift credit for one thing. Too many times in critical essays I see individuals heavily criticising a practice and then not offering any viable alternatives, and Swift takes care to introduce some of these while still keeping this focus on the ironic sarcasm that's throughout the novel. Or essay. The proposal is one in which he believes will allow Ireland to sell their own produce without danger of offending England, as the meat would be too tender to export, and therefore they would have a viable reason for keeping it as a native delicacy. It would be too tender to even salt for exportation, which is my favourite part of the essay, as he straight up says, "I could name a country which would be glad to eat up our whole nation without it." The absolute shade of it all. He invites criticism of his proposal, but he asks that those who do consider an alternative way to find food for 100,000 useless individuals that's as effective and cheap as his method. He asks positions that seek to oppose the proposal to ask new parents whether they would rather their baby be sold for food in a few years' time or suffer poverty, famine, homelessness, and other problems that plague the human condition. He concludes the essay by saying that while he has proposed this method, he has no means or intention of practicing it, ending with, "I have no children by which I can propose to get a single penny, the youngest being 9 years old, and my wife past childbearing," reflecting how the elites who try and find a solution are often detached from the consequences themselves and unwilling to practice what they preach. So that was a modest proposal, and yeah, I don't really know how to rate any of this. The essay is of course very well written and influential for both the time period and the modern subgenre of satirical essays. As mentioned, I also like that alternative solutions are proposed, but once you get the point, it's kind of it. It's short and quick, it has a point, it conveys it at the end. The problem is that it's kind of hard to rate a text like this, especially seeing as I'm not an expert of the political climate of the time. There is of course some questionable material, but that is of course to be expected of a text of this period. It was alright to read, not necessarily enjoyable, but it wasn't supposed to be. For my general rating, I'm going to give it a 5 out of 10. I'm very impartial to it, and I personally found the context more interesting than the essay itself, but it's in no way a bad essay. It's just not relevant to me, and it wasn't written for my leisure. When a text isn't even written for me to enjoy, it's kind of hard to rate how much I enjoyed it. It's definitely worth a read if you're interested in this part of history or the art of satire and irony. As for how disturbing it is, it's going to be a 1 out of 10. I kind of understand why it's on the list. It's disturbing at face value for the very concept of child cannibalism, but realistically it's more ridiculous and humorous than anything, since we know that the author himself is trying to write a obscene proposal. The irony and very matter-of-fact tone, along with the language of the period, makes it kind of campy in a way. It sort of reminds me of Pride, Prejudice and Zombies. The real historical context is of course horrific and should not be taken lightly, but since the text doesn't really aim to go into the realities of the suffering people of Ireland, the horror of the situation doesn't translate over to the reader. If this was written now, it would be horrifying, as we'd of course have to examine the circumstances in which such irony was written. But now that particular era of the conflict is over, it's not quite as thought-provoking. It's a little bit less moving. It wasn't written to be scary per se, more to shock and provoke thought and emotions, and it definitely succeeded at the time. Let's see what other people have to say about it. It has a 4.02 star average rating on Goodreads, Will Wheaton, a fellow author, rated it 5 stars along with a brief review that simply says, "Unbelievably funny satire that is painfully relevant today, a couple hundred years after it was written." Whereas Nicole rated it 1 star and says, "Things I don't like about this book. 1. It's satire. I'm not a big fan of satire. 2. It's written like a rhetorical essay. Rhetoric and I didn't get along in college and our relationship has not improved. 3. While I know Mr. Swift is using the idea of cannibalism as satire and in truth encouraging thoughtfulness towards the poor, the subject matter is very disconcerting. At least it only took 15 minutes to read." To be fair, I don't really know what Nicole, an avid hater of satirical rhetoric essays that deals with disturbing subject matter, was expecting to get out of this satirical rhetoric essay that deals with disturbing subject matter. But my favourite review is from Kristen, who simply states, "I know this is a little different and I maybe didn't give as much feedback as usual on it, but as mentioned, historical essays that do not pertain to me or my knowledge are hard to write effectively. Trust me, I'll have a lot more to say in the next one, which will be..." As I lay dying. So thank you guys once again for watching. If you have any thoughts on the essay or political situation that it arose from, please share them down below, and I'll see you all next time. Bye for now.